Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CDS Lab webinar series, and I'm very happy to have Kubi Ackerman to give the presentation. And Jeffrey, would you mind to do the introduction? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Raven. I'm an associate professor at the New York Institute of Technology, New York Tech. I would focus on the graduate program in urban and regional design. Our City as Lab Research Coordination Network is a National Science Foundation funded initiative aiming to explore the nexus of urban food, energy, and water systems. So I'm really pleased to present, we are really pleased to present the team here. The City as Lab team is really pleased to present our event today titled Mapping New York City's Food System, Design Approaches to Urban Food Supply Resilience with leading expert Kubi Ackerman. Kuby Ackerman is a designer, he's a consultant and a curator, and most recently of the exhibition Who We Are, Visualizing New York City by the Numbers at the Museum of the City of New York, which showcases the work of artists and designers working with census data and other demographic data. I've known Kubi for a long time, and over the course of his career, he has really sought to address some of the complex social and environmental challenges that we face, and has really spearheaded projects focusing on urban food systems, climate change adaptation, and development policy. He's currently an independent consultant collaborating with Think Design, the National Building Museum, the Climate Museum, and Data Through Design. And recently, from 2015 to 2019, he was director of the Future City Lab at the Museum of the City of New York, which was absolutely amazing to see the work that he was generating out of that platform. It was an interactive gallery space dedicated to engaging the public on the big challenges facing the city in the coming generations, including climate change and housing affordability. Prior to his tenure at the museum, he held positions at Cooper Union Institute for Sustainable Design and at the Urban Design Lab at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where he collaborated with climate and social scientists to communicate and apply their findings to decision-making processes at local and regional scales. So today, we're very fortunate that Kubi will discuss his efforts to map New York City's food system and the application of design approaches to food supply resilience. The work is going to cover research into the complex issue of urban food environment and food supply, which was particularly compelling during this period of COVID, and highlighting projects which are being undertaken in partnership with municipal agencies and other research and advocacy organizations. He'll be presenting his work on mapping and evaluating food production trends, transportation and distribution infrastructure, food retail, consumption at the variety of scales, local and regional, and will explore social, environmental, economic, and public health impacts of various strategies to create alternative supply chains. So with that, I give the floor over to Kuby Ackerman, and really look forward to hearing your presentation, Kubi, and then afterwards we'll have a session where we can take questions from the audience and have a discussion. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thanks to the entire RCN team for inviting me to present today. It's a real honor. Really appreciate the work that this consortium is doing, and so I'm very glad to have the opportunity to present some of my work as part of this webinar series, which so far has been really fantastic. I just want to make sure, Cecilia, I'm getting notices that there are people in the waiting room. I'm not sure if you're seeing those. I just want to make sure that everyone who wants to join is able to join.
All the co-hosts has been able to attend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just one thing, just to the audience, make sure if you have questions, feel free to send them by chat, and we can field them that way as well. Okay, Kubi, it's all yours.
Okay, all right, thank you. Again, yes, so thanks for that introduction. I'm glad I don't have to give too much background about myself, so I'm just going to launch right into the presentation. But I just want to state, this is what I'm going to be presenting is work that I was involved in about almost a decade ago at this point. It's been updated a little bit, but I do want to give the caveat that some of the facts and figures you will see as part of this presentation are a little bit outdated, but I'm fairly confident that the overall principles and direction of the work is as relevant today as it was back then. Let's see. There we go. So this is work that was done principally when I was part of the Urban Design Lab at the Earth Institute at Columbia, which is a fairly small research unit within the Earth Institute that's directed by the noted planning and housing scholar Richard Ponce and Maria Paula Suto, which seeks to essentially apply design thinking principles that are used in architecture and urban design to larger scale complex urban challenges, including things like climate change, adaptation, mitigation, green infrastructure work, and increasingly during the time that I was there, looking at food systems. So part of their mandate is also to essentially help apply a lot of the original research being done by earth and environmental scientists and climate scientists, epidemiologists, et cetera, at the Earth Institute to communities, mainly at the local scale here in New York City, but they have some global projects as well. So essentially, we got involved in food systems work actually originally through a grant on the part of a health insurance company, which was looking for a kind of out-of-the-box design-based approach to the challenge of childhood obesity, which obviously for them was an issue of the bottom line. And so what I'm showing here is, I think their expectation, frankly, was in going to a group of planners and architects is that we would focus principally on opportunities for increasing physical activity in urban areas. But after doing a pretty comprehensive literature review, looking at almost 700 different articles on all the different, classifying them on all the different factors that relate to diet-related disease and their amenability to intervention, which we classified on that kind of sliding scale, we really decided pretty early on to focus on the food environment, that really if we're going to have an impact on this issue, that as a society, we really need to focus on changing the food environment. And what I'm showing here is a spider diagram, just kind of looking at all those different factors and classifying them. But it's also to demonstrate the ways in which these design thinking tools, in this case diagramming, were used not only as communication tools for the client, but also to assist with decision making. So this was kind of the first big step that we decided to focus on the food environment as opposed to physical activity in the directions we were taking. So just to give another couple of examples of this kind of diagrammatic approach, this is looking at the unintended consequences of the Food and Farm Bill, which, as many of you probably know, is the major piece of legislation which is up for reauthorization before Congress, I think every 5 years or so, which is, determines almost all of our national agricultural policy, in addition to setting funding for food assistance and SNAP benefits and things like that. Which, part of what you can see here is that it's a hugely complex piece of legislation, which is, increasingly bloated as its mandate has grown and grown and grown, and has all sorts of unintended consequences, both environmental and on public health. And those one of the things we're looking to communicate as potential changes to some of these policies. Another quick example here is again, this health insurance company was interested in, they've been hearing about the fact that, fresh and healthy food are often more expensive on a per calorie basis than processed unhealthy food, which on the face of it is a little bit counterintuitive given the extra labor and energy that goes into processing foods. And they were wondering why that was. And we spoke to quite a few economists, and again, took a look at a lot of the research around these issues and produced a report. But as part of that, we were very interested in presenting the information visually. So kind of summarizing, obviously in some ways oversimplifying in some of these diagrams, but summarizing a vast amount of information in an easy to understand visual format, explaining, all along the value chain, essentially from production through retail, through consumption, why it was that these highly processed foods were often more affordable to people. I just want to back up a little bit before I go too deep into this, I think at that point, this was again about a decade ago, there were certainly quite a few questions we were getting as to why, architects and designers were interested in the food system. It was a little bit kind of like outside our lane in a sense. I think those questions are less prevalent today. I think partly as evidenced by some of the presentations, we've seen as part of this webinar series. I think it's not such a strange thing, but back then, what I'd often point to is this, as we all know, is the fact that for the first time in human history, we're living in a predominantly urban world, which I think from the perspective of urban design presents us with both the kind of huge challenges in terms of the pace of urbanization, as well as some pretty significant opportunities in terms of transforming lifestyles to be more sustainable. So that's obviously of central interest to architects, planners, and urban designers. And one could argue that this major shift, which represents perhaps the most significant mass migration in human history, is due principally to changes in the food system. So for most of human history, out of necessity, a majority of the world's population was directly involved in food production and therefore distributed across the mostly rural landscape. With industrialization and mechanization, depending on your perspective and depending on the part of the world, one could argue that either freed up labor to concentrate on other skills and other things, or displaced people from the countryside into cities because there are no longer opportunities in the countryside. And those cities in turn have grown and grown and grown, displacing agricultural lands around them, such that food has to come from farther and farther away, which obviously has impacts on the necessity for innovations in processing, storage, and distribution, and things like that. So our story of urbanization is as much a story of how and where we get food from as it is anything else. So it's very much a concern, I would argue, of architects and urbanists. Of course, that shift from predominantly rural to urban and suburban happened in the United States earlier than it has been happening in much of the rest of the world. And in that sense, I think one can look to the food system in the United States and how it's developed in the ensuing kind of health impacts as a way of kind of presaging what is happening in a lot of other places. And certainly this is one of those cases where the data is a little bit outdated. Even pre-COVID, New York City's population has been growing actually much more slowly in the past 5 years. It's essentially plateaued and now maybe decreasing very slowly. But we, in the United States, are continuing to experience urbanization, but it is really dwarfed by what's happening in much of the rest of the world. Even now, still with my understanding is even with COVID, in many parts of the world, urbanization is really continuing at an incredibly rapid pace, and this has huge impacts on cities, obviously, but also on food systems, along with this, for the first time in human history, as we've shifted to a majority urban population, we have now more people suffering from diseases of overnutrition than of undernutrition, and for the first time. In some ways, that's a success. Obviously, it's not true across the world, but by and large-scale famines just don't exist in the way they have, they did for much of human history. But we now have other problems, principally around diet-related disease. And if you look at the increase here in the speed of increase in something like obesity, this is also to a certain extent true of diabetes and other chronic diseases. You can see that the pace of change is such that, obviously our bodies, our genetics are not changing at all this fast. Something's happening in the environment. Something has been happening since about the 1980s that has really led to a quite significant impact on our overall public health. So this is one of the things that we are interested in looking at. And just by the way, stepping back, if anyone's wondering what this has to do with New York City, the structure of this presentation is kind of going from the global to the national, then more down into the regional and local. So I'll get there. So we're interested in what was that shift? And there's no one simple answer, but there are certainly clues. If you look, for example, at the amount of calories available per person for most of the 20th century, it fluctuated within this fairly narrow plus or minus 300 calorie range until the 1970s, when it kind of jumped the rails a little bit. And that was due to, again, to a pretty wide variety of different factors, including increasing globalization of the food system, but also due to national agricultural policy, which sometimes some people refer to as the cheap cheap food policy, which again is an oversimplification, but does point to a real focus on increasing the amount of calories in the overall food system, and a focus, really a national focus on the production of commodity crops. And so that there was a significant change that really coincided with the very steep rise of dietary disease. And certainly from a health perspective, I mean, we've seen COVID notwithstanding, and obviously this year is going to be different, is that costs and incidence of acute diseases have been steadily decreasing throughout the 20th and early 21st century, whereas incidence of chronic diseases, almost all of which have a dietary component, have been increasing. So this is just kind of, it's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but we're looking at just a few of the ingredients. This is back when they discontinued the Twinkie. We're looking at just a few of the ingredients that go into the making of a Twinkie, and just seeing how for such a simple product, the complexity of the supply chain, again, this is just a few of those ingredients, is really quite staggering, and I think points to we now have this entirely globalized food system. This is partially due to the relationship between the costs of labor versus fuel in the United States, right, where labor is higher and fuel is comparatively cheaper, which allows for this type of highly networked globalized system. But it obviously comes with quite a few inefficiencies and externalities, both on public health and the environment. So moving on to kind of like look at the national scale here, I was talking about the focus on commodity crops. This is just looking at one of our commodity crops, which is corn production, and comparing it to vegetable production. You can see at the scale bar there that there's kind of an order of magnitude difference in terms of the acreage that's being represented here. But it is telling that the USDA considers vegetables specialty crops as opposed to the commodity crops. And one thing you'll notice is obviously the concentration of commodity crops, in this case, mainly in the American Midwest, whereas specialty crops, which is to say vegetables, which are, where we get most of our nutrients, is concentrated more along the coasts in more marginal soils. Two things I want to point out here is that, one thing is, there's often this kind of, this oversimplified debate in the public consciousness and public press as to whether or not organic food systems can really feed the world, or whether we have to stick with industrialized food systems the only way to go, a growing population. And I feel like those arguments are sometimes a little bit of a red herring. First of all, our industrialized food system, as many people have pointed out, is not doing a particularly great job of feeding the world, at least when it comes to overall health. And secondly, when it comes to just the efficiencies in the system, we're using some of the most productive land on the entire planet as has existed in the Midwest, due to basically the soils are incredibly rich from the last glaciation. We're using it for largely for food, which is not even for human consumption so much. This is for animal feed, whereas on our more marginal lands and more marginal soils is where we're producing a lot of our fruits and vegetables. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it is certainly a pretty large inefficiency. One of the kind of silver linings of this map, as I would argue, is that if you look around where our population is concentrated around a lot of urban areas, is where you see a greater diversification of agriculture. And one of the things that I will be talking about that we did look at is, as far as the overall resilience of the food system, that diversification is a very important component of that. So to a certain extent, we do have some of the kind of building blocks already in place of that if you look at urban food systems and where that type of production is concentrated. Of course, at the national level, policy is still very much focused on the production of commodity crops. I've talked to economists about this. There's a lot of debate as to the extent to which subsidies actually contribute to the difference between, difference in price between healthy and unhealthy food. It's not so clear that simply eliminating or changing those subsidies would necessarily solve the problem, but it does kind of point to the overall priorities of the federal administration when it comes to what type of agriculture to be supported. And this is, again, just this is not my map, but it's a beautiful illustration of how land is used in the United States. And the food we eat, you can see there concentrated this is not mapping where it actually is, but it's just a breakdown of the overall land use. You can see that it's relatively small compared to overall agricultural land, including things like cow, and, pasture, and livestock feed exports, wheat exports, etc. So this whole question of how can we feed our population is really a question of land use and where the most appropriate land use is, and there's a lot of changes that can be made, I believe, to make it more responsive to the actual health and environmental needs of our population. And of course, there's I know that food deserts is not really a term that's used that much, anymore. But the basic point of access to fresh, healthy food is one that remains, I think, very much germane. And when we think about where food is grown and who has access to it, both in rural and in urban areas, I think it just points to some of the inefficiencies in the system to point out that in these farming-dependent counties where they're very much dependent on agriculture, some of the same places in the country where it's actually very difficult to find fresh, healthy food. So that's a little bit of a paradox, which points to, again, some of the inefficiencies in the system, as well as some of the misplaced economic priorities in our food system overall. And that is true, like I said, of urban areas as it is, as much as, if not more so, than rural areas where you have these really stark disparities, both in terms of, this is just looking at correlation. Of course, there's many factors that go into public health, not just food access, but food access is certainly one of them. There's a high degree of correlation between diet-related disease and lack of healthy food access, as well as it's just huge disparities. And, between Upper West Side, for example, which has an obesity rate of somewhere around 9%, as opposed to East Harlem, where it's triple that amount just by crossing 96th Street in Manhattan. So this is, we were working at that point with the Department of Public Health on looking to kind of visualize and map some of these factors, including food access is a tricky one because it's not just access to unhealthy food, it's also access to healthy food that's very important. So other researchers developed a kind of ratio score to quantify that relationship, how close you are to unhealthy versus healthy food access. And we were experimenting with different ways to visualize that, including these types of datascapes that we overlaid over Harlem, East Harlem in this case, using data that was collected by the Department of Health, looking at food access and food retail in that neighborhood. So after looking, examining a lot of these different factors, we were interested in kind of looking at how this plays out on a more regional level. And we were working actually at that point with the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture in Carytown, New York, with some folks there who were working on what they were calling at that point some food shed initiatives, looking at a more regionalized system and what could be done at a regional scale to address public food access, affordability, and demand. And again, this is an old concept now, but it's essentially the point being that New York City is a prime example of an urban area that recognized very early on in its development the necessity of creating for the resilience of the city, for the survival of the city, really a watershed, basically a protected area that's even has in some ways is under New York City's jurisdiction, that allows for the continued supply of clean water and real infrastructural and political investment in that. And so many people are arguing, well, although it would be much more complicated, what if something similar were developed for food? And I think the point to make here is that unlike, say, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, the New York City watershed is not so much like a hydrological and geological designation as it is an infrastructural one. Right? Like an infrastructure was put in place to make this happen. It doesn't just, it's not just kind of a natural phenomenon. And so similarly, we were looking with a lot of other people at the possibility of doing something similar for the New York region. Of course, we have to consider the fact that New York City is right in the middle of the most densely populated region in the country. So it's, it's everyone's needs would have to be somehow met and balanced in a case like this. And Oh, I should also mention that we were looking at, most people don't think of New York City as or New York State really as a farming state, but it is. Agriculture is a major part of New York State's economy. Got about 7 million acres of agricultural land within New York State, also about 7 million acres within 200 miles of the region. Of course, the type of agriculture and the type of land that's available for farming here is very different than in other places. Places like the Midwest, much smaller plots. Generally, the soils are a little bit more difficult to work with, more slopes. So the type of agriculture is out of necessity a little bit different. I mean, some people say that, for example, it's more suitable for pasture, certainly than for any sort of large-scale commodity crop production. But there is quite a lot of opportunities. So we're also looking at not only the opportunity in the existing agricultural land, but opportunities for expanding agriculture in underutilized or underdeveloped space. One of the things, obviously, that we have to consider in this scenario is climate change. The USDA has publishes an index of agricultural suitability, which they had to update for the first time since it was published, I believe, 5 or 10 years ago, to account for the realities of climate change, that things are shifting quite rapidly. Certainly any farmer can tell you that. And one of the interesting things about this is when we think about our traditional breadbasket areas of the Midwest or California, certainly when it comes to things like fruits and vegetables, there are huge challenges there in terms of drought and groundwater, which are only projected to get worse and worse. And so I think a real question is in the coming decades is whether as a nation and even as a world, whether we can continue to rely on agricultural production in those areas to the degree that we have so far, and what types of pressures that might put on places like the Northeast, where most projections, and the Northwest for that matter, where most projections are that precipitation is likely to increase, which in some ways might be a good thing for agriculture, but again, it's quite complicated because it also leads to additional soil erosion and things like that. So if you think about the development pressures, both from urbanization as well as conservation. So we have now a lot more forested area in the Northeast than we did 100 years ago, largely due to conservation efforts and, frankly, the concentration of agriculture in other areas. I think it's not, it's certainly easy to imagine that that there'll be really increased pressures on the land base in the Northeast for food production, along with everything else. So that's one thing that we have to think about and ideally start to plan for now, especially given that largely due to economic factors, the change in cropland acreage, the amount of area under production in places like New York State has been decreasing fairly rapidly for decades now, just because the type of kind of small scale production is so challenging in the globalized system. So we were really looking, going back to the whole question of infrastructure. There's clearly there is a lot of agriculture taking place in the region. There's a lot of small farmers who are very interested in increasing their access to urban markets. There's certainly demand in urban areas, and yet there's a disconnect there, which is largely has to do with the bottleneck of processing and distribution. So, the kind of classic example that's often used is if you go to a New York City, New York State is the second largest apple producing state in the country after Washington. If you go to a New York City bodega, you're just as likely to find an apple from Washington State as New York State, and that has everything to do with infrastructure. It has to do with the fact that there's a highly centralized, cold storage that's connected directly to the CSX rail line, which comes to Albany and allows for that product to get very quickly and efficiently without bringing cold storage into New York City and Hunts Point or other markets. Whereas a smaller scale apple farmer from the Hudson Valley, only 100 miles as opposed to 3,000 miles away, may be depending on much less efficient diesel trucks to try and get their product down into the city. So what can be done to bolster like regional processing and distribution infrastructure is something that we're very interested in exploring. So we're looking at the existing infrastructure. Also, something like green markets, for example, which obviously is a huge, important contribution to New York City's food environment and food availability, but it's quite difficult to scale. If you think about the fact that the requirement is that the farmer has to be on site, at the market. And it's a huge challenge for a lot of farmers, many of whom are driving 2, 3, sometimes even 4 hours away in fairly small, inefficient trucks. So again, it's a fantastic system. I think there are real challenges to scaling that up to a degree that that would really have a major impact on food availability in the food system in the city. So we're looking at kind of a more, rather than a kind of an arbitrary 200-mile radius, we're looking at drive time scenarios for what would it take to establish this more regionalized infrastructure. We're talking with a variety of other players in the system, other companies that have existing cold storage infrastructure, some of which might be underutilized, that could be used. And here we're doing a kind of a fairly rough analysis of where existing production is already taking place. These are kind of a weighted center of a certain amount of different types of commodities. Because obviously they have different processing and distribution needs, and that just kind of showing diagrammatically this concept of a spoken hub model, where you might be able to concentrate aggregation, processing, and distribution centers throughout the region, really based on where existing production is taking place, and maybe even doing further aggregation outside the city. These are kind of distribution systems which, to a certain extent, existed some time ago. Obviously, in a time when the population and production demands were much lower. So the question here really is kind of a really open-ended research question: is could something like this be reinstated or redeveloped or developed in a new way to meet contemporary demands? And so we did do a study in Orange County, where in the Black Dirt region, which has a concentration of a lot of folks producing produce. We talked to a number of farmers up there, asked them about their needs and demands, and we're looking at the feasibility of creating a food hub, essentially a aggregation distribution hub somewhere in Orange County that would essentially allow those small producers to be able to aggregate product and compete with some of the larger national producers to get their food into the city. And so we're working with a lot of different partners on this, but looking at the feasibility of establishing a food hub somewhere in the Hudson Valley around these different products. I'm going to skip through this quickly because I know we're running short on time. And to kind of zoom in a little bit on what some of the implications of that might be at the city scale, where there used to be wholesale markets distributed throughout the 5 boroughs. It's no longer the case. Everything became aggregated at Hunts Point. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a lot of the challenges around Hunts Point, a lot of the inefficiencies. So we're again looking at, as kind of an open-ended question, what it would mean, what the implications might be to redistribute city scale wholesale market infrastructure to kind of meet more localized demand. If you look at how retail and food processing establishments are distributed throughout the city, it's, I think, far from clear that having one centralized location at Hunts Point is the most effective and most efficient way to do that. So that's one of the things we're looking at. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit to focus on another project that came out of it. Again, when we're working on this, we kind of saw these as nested circles in a sense, with the kind of national, regional, and more localized scale of inquiry into food systems. But we were the Urban Design Lab, through a lot of this work, became interested in urban agriculture and participated along with many others on the advisory group for the city council when Christine Quinn was developing a comprehensive set of food policy guidelines around 2010, 2011. I can't remember exactly when, when I believe the council and folks in government in general at that point were, they were hearing a lot of buzz around urban agriculture. And we're looking to understand it a little better. And so we, along with the Design Trust for Public Space and Evan Cohen working there and others, we're looking at the feasibility of urban agriculture in New York City. I think they're very interested in the potential benefits of food security, like how much food can actually be produced. And whereas the Design Trust was focusing a lot on kind of the economic and social implications of urban agriculture, because of our base at the Earth Institute, we were focused a little more on some of the environmental implications around things like stormwater runoff, energy use, and waste management. So there are kind of a number of complementary projects that were focused at that time on the potential for increasing urban agriculture. This is a very outdated map at that point of all the different operations that were that were going on at that point. I think some of these have disappeared, but I would imagine that if I were to make this map today, that there'd be many new ones on the map. But I think this also the fact that in the nation's most densely populated city, there's often some surprise at how much agricultural production is taking place is largely, a legacy of the community gardening movement, which arose in opposition to Giuliani's development policies in the 80s and 90s, and it was largely due to their persistence that the kind of new wave of urban agriculture enthusiasts and operations were able to spring up in the 21st century. But there's quite a bit already going on. So one of the things we're looking at is we would often get this question: well, how much food can you actually produce in New York City? Does it actually make a difference? And I think to us, it was a little bit of a red herring, but in the sense that I don't think that anyone is really arguing that a place like New York City could or even should be self-sufficient in terms of food. I don't think that's the goal. However, I think, as far as how much it could contribute in particular areas to the availability and affordability of fresh and healthy food, particularly in areas that don't already have much of that availability, as well as what some of the economic benefits might be to producers, was something that we were interested in looking at. And so we did kind of a back of the envelope calculation of how much land you might need to produce all of the fruits and fruit and vegetable needs of the city, and we came up with a pretty wide range here in terms of acreage, of course. Showing that there's no way, even for fruits and vegetables, you could produce enough for the city itself. Again, I think if you look at a much more localized scale at a neighborhood level, which I'll be talking about in a second, that some of these determinations might be a little bit different. But one of the things we're interested in doing is just first off doing an analysis of what land might be available. Of course, focusing the low-hanging fruit is land that's vacant. So looking at private vacant land, public vacant land, existing community gardens, with the public vacant land, that is land that's for the most part, under the jurisdiction of municipal agencies, as well as some state and federal agencies that's not, at least not being used for any designated purpose at this point, as being, areas that would be most amenable to influence through public policy. And in fact, after these reports came out, the City Council did in fact pass a law that asked municipal agencies to evaluate their vacant land for the suitability of urban agriculture. I think there were mixed results from that, because I think it's a tall ask for a lot of agencies that aren't, that's not necessarily their expertise, is to understand what constitutes suitability. But it was a start. And other things, we're interested in other types of areas as well, like underutilized open space. That's essentially spaces in parkland that's not currently open to the public. There's certainly a lot of interest in NYCHA developments, which we did a kind of rough calculation that about 50% of the overall land base in NYCHA properties is underutilized, in the sense that it's open space, much of which is not even accessible to the residents of those areas, depending on kind of maintenance costs. And certainly, there's already now several urban farms that have been opened on NYCHA properties. Surface parking is, traditionally an area which contributes, disproportionately to runoff and heat island effects, and some other cities have had success in kind of mandating that a certain percentage of surface parking be designated as green space. So there may be opportunities there, particularly in the outer boroughs. As well as other types of spaces, and privately owned public space, which also has a mandate for a certain, it needs to be a certain amount needs to be planted in green in addition to private yards. We're also particularly interested in the possibility of rooftop agriculture. So, my general kind of approach, take on this is that it's rooftop agriculture is a little bit of a trend. We may have heard of about 10 years ago. It's still very much alive. It's in general, it's a quite challenging way to grow food. And if you can grow food on the ground, it's certainly quite a bit more complicated and expensive and challenging to do so on top of the building for a variety of different reasons. And in general, I'd say it doesn't make sense, except for in places like New York City, which are very highly developed and which happen to have obviously a very large consumer base, or you don't have to travel far to find consumers, and it also happens to have in particular neighborhoods the type of buildings that may already be largely suitable. So we use a variety of different criteria to try and identify existing buildings, built between certain years that already have already are likely to have the structural capacity to be able to withstand the additional weight of rooftop agriculture. Is, there were a certain size, it has to be of a certain size, not too tall, not currently being used for noxious use, et cetera. And there's a surprising amount of you can see real concentrations around in Queens, around Newtown Creek, along the Brooklyn waterfront, South Bronx, certainly, in other areas where there's quite a bit of potential. I was working with a grad student who was working with the Newtown Creek IBZ on creating an online interactive tool for the Newtown Creek IBZ to be able to identify potential sites for rooftop agriculture there. So this is just kind of an overview of all the different types of land that are available. Again, it's not a huge amount, but in a place like New York City, and again, not to say that every single one of these sites we identified is suitable, but it's kind of just an overview of the potential with Central Park there as a comparison. So a significant amount of sites that may be available for rooftop agriculture. And since we did this study, there's additional opportunities that people are discussing, including floating controlled environment, like floating greenhouses, essentially, which is being proposed for Hunts Point. You see here in a couple of renderings, which could be combined with photovoltaics. Of course, one of the huge questions around urban agriculture is the suitability of the soils. In a place like New York City, I think the automatic assumption is that your soil is going to be contaminated unless proven otherwise. For a lot of producers, they're not necessarily using soil on the ground, but they're getting soil from elsewhere, whereas others are really seeing soil remediation as part of what they're interested in. And of course, that comes with all sorts of complications, but it's certainly possible to do this even in urban environments. So going back to the question of what the actual potential is, like I was saying before, what we're really aiming to focus on is that there are particular neighborhoods in New York City where you have a confluence of different factors, including high prevalence of diet-related disease, low existing fruit and vegetable consumption, largely due to the lack of availability. So again, this is a little bit old, but this is the original fresh zones or incentive zones that the city established to incentivize the creation of new healthy food retail, are outlined here in blue. In addition to the income, so these are not coincidental that a lot of these neighborhoods are lining up, right? Where you have low access to fresh and healthy foods, low income, high prevalence of dietary disease, also happen to be the places where there's the greatest availability of vacant land, again, for reasons that are probably not too difficult to imagine. And so it's in those areas where we believe the greatest potential is for urban agriculture to actually have an impact on the overall food environment and food availability. Processing and storage is certainly an issue, but there's a lot of existing institutional processing and facilities and kitchens, which a lot of urban growers have already had established relationships with in schools and places like that. And one of the things we were really interested in pointing out was that it's interesting working with municipal agencies because they each have their own kind of mandate of what they're concerned with. and something, and they're often concerned with understanding what the most cost-effective way of dealing with particular challenges. So, for example, something like stormwater runoff or something like that related disease. And there are approaches such as urban agriculture, which may not be the most effective way of addressing any one of those challenges individually. However, if you look at the kind of cross-cutting potential of something like urban agriculture, which can function as a form of green infrastructure in addition to all the other benefits, in addition to providing economic opportunities that other types of green infrastructure may not, I think there's a strong argument to be made for incentivizing or otherwise providing public support to urban agricultural practices. That's a difficult argument to make to a lot of these agencies, again, because they're not used to, they're very siloed and they're not used to thinking in these cross-cutting ways. But that's essentially one of the main points of this study, was to demonstrate that. The DEP did, in fact, support, after some study, a number of different urban agriculture operations as part of their stormwater management grant program. And at the time that I left the Urban Design Lab, we were doing a number of studies on the kind of implications of rooftop agriculture as a form of green infrastructure and how rooftop farms, in this case, Brooklyn Grange, performed relative to more conventional green roofs, because they actually function very, very differently, as you can imagine. The soil depth has to be a lot, has to be a lot greater. They need to be irrigated, unlike regular green roofs. And so there's a lot of questions as to how that would work. But we were aiming to answer those questions. And there's a number of studies that are still ongoing about that at Columbia. In addition to, like I was, exploring different ways of charting, using the DEP water quality assessments to help urban farmers make decisions on things as to when to irrigate, which I think would be useful to kind of demonstrate the impact on green infrastructure, as well as the potential for urban farms and community gardens to contribute to or help rather the problem of the urban heat island effect. So if you look at these areas which are most impacted, you can see that there's a pretty strong correlation between that map I showed earlier of parts of the city that are most suitable for rooftop agriculture, and it's largely for the same reasons. Right? It's these very large, often tar-covered industrial buildings that are, or surface parking and things like that. Basically, areas that are, that are most contributing to the urban heat island effect have the most potential for rooftop agriculture to help mitigate that. This is looking at the whole issue of waste and organic waste. So this diagram was made prior to the municipal composting program. That program, as you probably know, has been discontinued, at least for now, due to COVID-related budget problems. So I'm not sure what this would look like now, but I wouldn't be surprised if it looks fairly similar as it did then. And so again, it was just looking at the potential for urban agriculture to help shrink the kind of waste cycle, if at least some organic waste could go directly back to local farms as opposed to being carted to landfill or even to composting facilities, which are far outside the city. So just really quickly, I know we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to breeze through these last couple of slides to just show that the kind of the neighborhood specificity is something we're looking at. As far as incentives and policies, it's difficult to institute a one-size-fits-all approach in a place as diverse as New York City. In places like Brownsville, with a lot of public housing and a lot of vacant land, may require a completely different approach than some place like Long Island City, which has much less housing and vacant land, but has a lot of large buildings that may be suitable for rooftop agriculture. So it's really a variety of different approaches might be needed to really help incentivize this type of activity in New York City. And anyways, I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides other than to say what I was talking about before, which is that we really do see that this type of work as being as part of this kind of larger nested scale of interventions that are needed at a local, regional, and national level to potentially, this is very speculative way of looking at the potential for kind of a national approach to a more regionalized and localized food system, not necessarily which would entirely displace the globalized industrialized food system, but rather work in parallel, potentially to increase the resilience of the overall system to things like economic and climate shocks. So I know I talked a lot, but with that, I would love to be able to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Kuby. That was very thought-provoking. You sort of covered global, metropolitan and local scales very effectively, and actually posed some really compelling questions in terms of distribution challenges that have not gone away since you did this work. So it's, and I think, so I guess one question, Cecilia, remind me, we have, how much time do we have at this point?
We have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I guess one question that I, have to kind of maybe start off is, and it relates to the point you made about, the debate that rages between should food be produced in the city, should it be instead that land which is very scarce, should be best used for other things than food production in terms of urban scale food production. I'm not talking about little, community farms, which is a bit different. So I guess with COVID, especially, we've had the situation around food security that is exacerbated, or at least it always existed, and then the curtain is drawn back. What do you think, what would be sort of a proper way to frame this question about a resilient local supply in relationship to the density of population that could feed a district for several days in the event of a catastrophe? Such as, obviously we're not trying to necessarily feed an entire metropolitan area locally, but is there something that you think makes sense? And you were talking about different neighborhoods from Brownsville to other neighborhoods in the city. Do you think there might be a sort of order of magnitude or a rule of thumb that might make sense for a city like New York to say, ensure that a certain number of days could be potentially covered in the event of catastrophe?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really tricky, because I think on the one hand, I definitely think that part of what this work is pointing to, I'd like to think, is a more networked and resilient system that's able to withstand the type of shocks you're talking about. So it's not an either or that, like, we're going to basically switch from this global industrialized system to a more localized system, because I think that's certainly something that's challenging and maybe not even desirable. But I think having kind of redundancy in the system is incredibly important, as was demonstrated, particularly in the early days of COVID, when there was quite a few breakdowns in the supply chain, and that I think is fairly minor compared to what we might expect with greater shocks to the system, including around things like climate change. So I think having that local and regional redundancy is incredibly important. And I think it's something that's, as far as the urban land base, it's true. It's a very difficult question. Like, do you build more housing or do you build more farms? Again, I don't think it's necessarily an either or, particularly with some of the work we've seen around integrating, controlled environment agriculture with housing and things like that. And not every site is suitable for housing, not every site is suitable for urban agriculture. So there's certainly, ways you can start to make some determinations about, how you might site these things. I think one of the, so I do think that there's a lot of really promising work and ideas around, around integration, like building integration in agricultural systems. I do think one has to be a little bit cautious. Sometimes, there can be a trend towards, the trend towards self-sufficiency is a tricky one, because there's often communities that are left out of that. I'm thinking of, for example, the new building standards, which mandate that buildings of a certain size in certain areas in New York City be able to be completely self-sufficient. in the case of like power outages and things like that for a certain number of days. And I think there's a danger to the kind of like walled castle idea. Like we've got ours and like everyone else is, out of luck. So that's where I think more kind of community-based integrated solutions are really important, as opposed to like, I think the building scale agriculture is great as long as it's part of a more integrated community approach to food supply, as opposed to, I think there is some danger with some of these developments that like high-end condo developments come with like a place to grow food on the roof or something like that that's very exclusive. I do think that, but again, yes, I think there's a lot of potential to if there's some way to integrate what's going on in community gardens with larger scale rooftop farms, with perhaps what's going on in private developments.
Or as a colleague of ours, Ted Liebman, mentioned, when parking garages are no longer necessary. Some of that could be used for mushrooms and those kinds of, which is the case in some.
Absolutely. No, I think and I think it's a great question.
Just in terms of, and this kind of ties in with the work that was presented by the research by Eugene Kwok, who as you know, presented with us a couple of weeks ago. Around the issue of land scarcity, and you mentioned that as well, regarding the competing priorities within a regional context. So we've got regional agriculture that competes with green energy, clean energy priorities, for example. So might this be an interesting, and I think we talked about this a little bit offline, but maybe for the group, the synergies between, say, clean energy generation within the region and regional agriculture. Might there be a synergy there that could exist? And is that something that we could explore further, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, it's a great question. It's not something I've looked at with a whole lot of specificity. I mean, I think it's a really interesting kind of research avenue. I mean, my response to that earlier was I'd be really interested to see what's happening in places like the Netherlands, and other places, and Israel, and places which have high population density, very limited land base, have a lot of intensive agricultural production going on, and in the case of the Netherlands, are also looking to increase their green energy production, and in fact have increased it quite a bit. And I think as Cecilia was mentioning, I think, part of that is also like there's a pretty sophisticated flexibility built into that system as well. So I think, things move around, there's a lot, there's also, like New York City, a place like Netherlands is dealing with water and rising sea levels. And there's a real sophistication in terms of seasonal and, seasonal land changes and phasing, right, of certain projects. So, and kind of flexible and movable infrastructure.
Sure.
So those are a lot of things, and I think the example I showed very briefly, that kind of that brief rendering of the proposal for Hunts Point addresses a lot of those issues. So as we're under threat from sea level rise, I think opportunities for building things on the water that could both be food production as well as energy production that are floating, and I think there's a lot to think about there.
We've gotten some really good sort of points from, Joshua Sperling has given us quite a lot. If you'll look at the notes, it's just sort of a lot of references. There's not too many questions there, but really some terrific references to tap into. So thanks, Joshua, for that. If you have a particular question, do let me do send. But I guess back to the kind of one big question, which is the regional food distribution challenges. I asked this to Joshua Foss a few weeks ago when he presented. And I'm really curious about disruptive transportation innovations that might be on the horizon. For example, as you had mentioned, within the sort of Black Earth region, upstate New York, or within the New York region, could, say, such a co-op, you talked about sort of a co-op or an organization, could they leverage, for example, down the road or could we imagine them leveraging maybe some sort of an autonomous freight vehicle to, or system to more easily access rural urban markets, so that, you know, it sort of some of the labor costs might be reduced for the single farmer to kind of schlep all of his or her goods to the city. Instead, it's sort of a gathering of these different farms, and there's autonomous vehicle that could potentially be.
Yeah.
And then from a circular economy perspective, might this same vehicle operate from the urban to rural direction, where the urban organic waste be loaded on these autonomous trucks to supply regional farms with compost for topsoil?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Look, you know, I would look both forward in terms of technology as well as backwards, in the sense that, you know, for so many decades we've been focused on road infrastructure and road distribution, and particularly in New York City, which is, you know, really, as far as large American cities go, unique in its lack of a centralized rail hub because of our geography. I think both what you're talking about, but then also, you know, it used to be that, you know, a lot of food came down by barge, which is quite efficient potentially. That, you know, that barge infrastructure on the Hudson doesn't exist anymore, but could certainly be reinstated. A lot of people have been talking about that, you know, getting barges down to either Hunts Point or the South Brooklyn waterfront, where there's a lot of capacity. And I think the same with rail. I mean, you know, I know that you know, Jerry Nadler's been talking about this you know, rail tunnel from New Jersey to South Brooklyn for, gosh, I don't know, decades now. And obviously that's a huge you know, cost, but I think there's real possibility there in you know, going back to, certainly with new technologies, but some of the more super efficient ways. Yeah. So
that's a conversation that will continue. And I know that we're wrapping up. We're pretty much out of time, Kuby. So there was one quick question about a map of the food waste in New York City that I think is a super compelling diagram that you would show and people were asking where they could find that. But I don't know if there's a website or something, or perhaps a link to your page. But
yeah, certainly most of this material can be found on the Urban Design Lab website. Certainly anyone's welcome to reach out to me directly.
Urban Design Lab website.
Like,
yeah. Sounds good. Okay. I know we're totally out of time. I want to thank you, Kuby, for joining us for a really fascinating presentation, and I wish we had more time to open it up for a larger discussion. But I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you to Cecilia and to colleagues in our NSF team, City as Lab team, for organizing this. And Cecilia, do you have any last points? I think this material will be available. It'll be recorded and available for those of you.
Yes, the recording, we will post the recording at the urbanview.net website, the RCM website. If you're interested, some of the topics, I think Kuby has directed us to the Urban Design Lab's website. Will make it available if you're interested. So I very much appreciate your talk, Kuby. I know that probably some of these materials is in the museum, has been displayed. When I think whenever the situation gets better, hopefully we can direct people to the exhibit sometime soon. Thank you very much for the talk, and I hope to keep our conversation going. I know there's going to be a lot of brainstorming session among the working groups, and there are a lot of people interested in regional systems. So we'll be, if you're interested, shoot us an email. We'll include you in some of the working groups. And
I just added our link for all of you who are on the call.
All right.
So
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you, Kuby. Talk soon.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.